Picture this. You're at the grocery store, cart half full, the kind of trip you've done 100 times. You're not buying anything special. Same cereal, same bread, same chicken you always get. You get to the register, and the total is higher than you expected. Not by a lot, maybe $12, $15. You pause. You look at the screen. You think about what you're putting back. And then you realize you didn't buy anything different. The cart is the same. The number just isn't. That moment is happening in checkout lines across this country right now, and most people chalking it up to bad luck or a bad week. It isn't either of those things. It's data. And the data just told us something important. The Bureau of Labor Statistics released the April 2026 CPI report on May 12th. Annual inflation came in at 3.8%. That is the highest reading since May 2023, a 3-year high. Not a forecast, not a warning from an economist on cable news. A number already locked into the official record. Now here's what makes that number different from the inflation most people remember. The last time prices ran this hot, people understood the story. Pandemic hit, supply chains seized up. Too much money chasing too few goods. Uncomfortable, but explainable. This time the story's more complicated because two separate forces showed up at the same time, and only one of them has fully landed in the April numbers yet. Gasoline is up 28.4% compared to a year ago. Energy overall up 17.9%, the steepest annual jump since September 2022. Food up 3.2%. Shelter costs jumped 0.6% in a single month. And the number that got the least coverage in most of the reporting. Real average hourly wages fell 0.3% year over year. Paychecks are growing in nominal terms. Inflation is growing faster. For the first time in 3 years, wages are losing the race. That gap, small as it looks on a percentage chart, is the difference between a household that's managing and one that's quietly starting to not manage. And here's the part that should give you pause. The energy shock from the conflict with Iran? That's visible in the April data. The tariff-driven inflation from the trade policy that's been building since 2025? Most of that is still sitting in a shipping container somewhere, or in a warehouse, or on a truck. It hasn't hit your receipt yet. The April number is not the peak. It may not even be close to the peak. That's what this video is actually about. Not the headline, the thing behind it. Most of the coverage you'll find on the April CPI report focuses on energy. Makes sense. Gasoline up 28% is a number that's hard to look away from. But energy prices, as brutal as they are right now, can reverse. Oil markets are volatile by design. A shift in the Iran situation, a diplomatic agreement, a change in supply expectations, any of those can bring gasoline prices down within weeks. They've done it before. What doesn't reverse quickly, what embeds itself slowly and stubbornly into the cost of almost everything, is tariff-driven goods inflation. And that part of the story is still arriving. One more thing worth sitting with before we go further. The April data was measured against prices from April 2025. That baseline already included a meaningful amount of tariff pass-through from the 2025 policy announcements. So the year-over-year comparisons is measuring new inflation on top of a base that was already elevated. What that means practically. The actual cumulative increase in what Americans are paying for everyday goods is larger than the 3.8% headline suggests. The full picture is worse. JP Morgan Asset Management projected headline CPI would reach 3.5% by the fourth quarter of 2025, before the Iran conflict added its own pressure on top. Core CPI in April came in at 2.8%, and headline CPI has already reached 3.8%, driven largely by the energy shock layered on top of tariff pressure. The trajectory is running ahead of what forecasters expected before the Iran factor entered the equation. The question now isn't whether prices are going up. That answer is in the data. The question is, what's driving it? Who's absorbing the cost? And what the next 6 months actually look like for a family trying to make their budget work. That's what we're going to break down. Let's start with the thing most people still don't fully understand about how tariffs reach your wallet. Because the timing of it is the whole story. Here's something that surprises most people when they actually hear it explained. The products sitting on store shelves right now, the ones you bought in April, the ones you'll buy next week, most of them were ordered months ago. A retailer places an order with a manufacturer overseas. That order gets produced, packaged, loaded into a shipping container, put on a cargo ship, crosses an ocean, clears customs, moves through a distribution center, gets loaded onto a truck, and finally arrives at a store. That process takes 3 to 6 months in normal conditions. What that means is that the inventory you've been buying this spring was largely ordered before the latest round of tariff escalations took full effect. You've been spending pre-tariff merchandise. The replacement inventory, ordered at the new, higher import costs, is still in transit. When it arrives on shelves, it will carry a different price tag. This is the mechanism that most inflation coverage completely skips. It's not complicated once you see it, but it explains something that a lot of people find confusing. Why haven't prices gone up more already if the tariffs are this significant? Because the system has a lag built into it. One day, the shelf price changes and it feels sudden, even though the cause was set in motion months earlier. The retailers already know what's coming. That's the part worth paying attention to. In February 2026, Walmart announced price increases of up to 10% on select consumer goods. Target made a similar announcement around the same time, citing both tariff-related cost increases and fuel surcharges across their logistics chain. These are companies telling their customers, plainly, that what things cost is changing. Amazon, FedEx, and USPS have each rolled out or expanded fuel surcharges in 2026. A Deloitte survey of 330 global retail executives found that 73% plan to adjust retail prices upward this year. When 3/4 of the retail industry is telling you prices are going up, that is a forecast worth believing. Harvard economists have been tracking retail prices in real time using barcode-level data, individual products across thousands of stores. Their findings through early 2026. Tariffs have raised retail prices of imported goods by an average of 6.8 percentage points. For domestic goods, things made here using imported materials and components, prices are up 4.8 points on average because American manufacturers aren't immune. They buy steel, aluminum, electronic components, fabric, and raw materials from overseas. The categories already seeing the largest increases aren't random. Clothing is up 17.5 percentage points. Building materials up 10.5. Coffee and tea up 10. Fish and seafood up 7.9. Household textiles up 8. Furniture up 7.4. These aren't luxury categories. These are things ordinary American households buy regularly. A back-to-school shopping trip that used to cost $200 for a couple of kids is now closer to $270 for the same items. That difference didn't come from anywhere obvious. No single item jumped dramatically. The tariff distributed itself across dozens of small increases that add up to something real by the time you get to the register. The Yale Budget Lab has been tracking the cumulative household impact. Their estimate: current tariff levels will cost the average household somewhere between $760 and $940 this year if certain provisions expire as scheduled, and between $100 and $1,500 if they're extended. Those are annual figures. Monthly, that's $65 to $125 in additional costs that weren't there before. For a family already spending close to their income, that's not an abstraction. That's the electric bill you can't fully pay, or the credit card balance you can't fully clear this month. And the key word in all of that is average, because the average number hides a story about who's actually absorbing this, and that story is more important than the headline. There's a version of inflation coverage that treats the 3.8% headline like it lands the same way in every American household. Same percentage, same pain, shared equally across the economy. That version is wrong. Slightly wrong. Structurally wrong. And understanding why it's wrong matters more than the number itself if you're trying to understand what's. The Yale Budget Lab ran the distributional math on tariff costs by income level. The finding: the burden on households in the bottom income decile, measured as a share of their after-tax income, is roughly 3 times larger than the burden on households in the top decile. 3 times. That's not a rounding error. It's not a political framing. It's arithmetic applied to how different households actually spend their money. The reason is straightforward. Lower-income families spend a higher percentage of what they earn on goods, food, clothing, household products, medications. Those are exactly the categories most exposed to tariff-driven price increases, and those households are concentrated at the lower end of the income scale. Put a real number on it. A household in the bottom income bracket absorbs an estimated $430 in additional annual costs if current Section 122 tariffs expire as scheduled, or up to $740 if they are extended, according to the Yale Budget Lab. A household at the top of the income scale faces roughly $800 under the expiration scenario, or approximately $3,100 if tariffs are extended. More in absolute dollars, but as a fraction of their total income, it barely registers. The percentage hit is what matters for financial stability, not the raw dollar amount. Now picture the household that makes this real. 2 working adults, modest apartment, manageable rent, no credit card balance carried month to month. Doing okay by most measures. Nothing flashy, but nothing falling apart either. This year, gasoline costs them roughly $1.20 more per gallon than it did a year ago. Groceries are running about $75 to $90 more per month for the same items. The kids needed new clothes for school and spring. What used to cost $200 now costs somewhere between $250 and $280 for the same brands at the same stores. The household's income went up 3.6% this year, which sounds like good news. But their costs went up faster across almost every category they can't avoid. The math that used to work barely works now, and their one unexpected expense, a car repair, a medical bill, a month of missed overtime, away from carrying a balance. That's the situation the April data is actually describing. Underneath the 3.8% headline, not a dramatic collapse, a quiet erosion. Month after month, the gap between income and expenses gets slightly smaller, and the margin that used to exist for absorbing surprises gets thinner. Housing economists have a term for what happens when housing costs exceed 30% of income. They call it cost-burdened. There's no equivalent term for what happens when the cumulative pressure of tariffs, plus energy costs, plus food costs, plus insurance costs all rise simultaneously. But the experience of it is recognizable to anyone living inside it. You don't have less money. You have the same money. It just covers less than it used to. And the month, you notice that shift. When you catch yourself putting something back at the register or deciding to skip the routine car maintenance, that's when the data on a page becomes something you feel. The communities absorbing this hardest aren't in the economic data's spotlight. They're the places where the nearest grocery store that accepts WIC is 20 minutes away, where a 10% increase in clothing prices means genuinely delaying a purchase, where a $70 monthly increase in gas spending is a real budgeting problem, not an inconvenience. Tariffs are regressive by design, not by intention, maybe, but by mechanics. And the people who spend the highest share of their income on consumption, because they have to, because necessities don't disappear when money is tight, are the ones who pay the highest effective rate. The Federal Reserve has been in the same uncomfortable position since the beginning of 2026, and they've been dealing with it the only way an institution that doesn't like to say uncertain things out loud can deal with it. By doing nothing and describing that choice in the most measured language possible. In late April 2026, the Fed voted to hold its benchmark interest rate steady for the third consecutive meeting of 2026, extending a period of inaction that has now stretched across multiple quarters. That sounds routine. The detail that isn't routine: 4 members dissented. 4 simultaneous dissents is the highest level of internal Fed disagreement since 1992. When an institution built around consensus starts fracturing that visibly, it's worth understanding what they're actually disagreeing about. The Fed has one primary tool for fighting inflation: raising interest rates. Higher rates make borrowing more expensive, which slows consumer spending, which reduces demand, which eventually brings prices down. That mechanism worked during the post-pandemic inflation spike. The problem this time is that tariff-driven inflation isn't caused by excessive demand. There's no spending boom driving prices up. There's a policy decision that raised the cost of imported goods, which flows through to retail prices regardless of how much or how little consumers are spending. The Fed can't make tariffs cheaper by hiking rates. What raising rates does in this environment is slow an economy that's already feeling squeezed while prices keep rising, a combination that economists are careful about naming too directly in public statements. So the Fed finds itself watching 2 problems that want opposite responses. A slowing economy and cautious consumers argue for rate cuts. Persistent inflation above the 2% target argues for rate hikes or at minimum no cuts. Choosing one direction means accepting that the other problem gets worse. The institution's response has been to wait, describe the situation as uncertain, and hold. The new Fed chair, Kevin Warsh, was nominated in part because President Trump expects him to deliver lower rates. Warsh himself has said he hasn't committed to rate cuts, and markets are currently pricing no cuts in 2026, with odds of a rate hike by year-end rising. His history as a sound money advocate adds further uncertainty to any path toward easing, regardless of the political pressure behind his appointment. Squaring any rate cuts with 3.8% inflation and a CPI reading that beat forecasts will not be straightforward regardless of who chairs the institution. The 4 dissents in April reflected that internal tension directly. 3 regional presidents objected to language that markets read as signaling a future cut. One governor voted for an immediate cut. The Fed's external communications and its internal voting record are pointing in different directions right now. For ordinary Americans, what this means practically is straightforward, even if the Fed's communications aren't. Mortgage rates stay elevated. The 30-year fixed is still sitting in territory that makes first-time home buying genuinely difficult for households earning median incomes. Auto loan rates stay elevated, which matters in a country where most people can't take public transit to work. Credit card rates, tied to the benchmark rate, remain at levels that make carrying a balance significantly more costly than it was 4 years ago. The borrowing tools that could theoretically help a family smooth out a rough stretch, a home equity line, a personal loan at a reasonable rate, remain expensive. And here's the part of the Fed story that got the least coverage in the April CPI reporting. Real average hourly wages slipped 0.5% for the month of April on a monthly basis and are down 0.3% year over year. Workers got raises. Their purchasing power still declined. That's not the Fed's fault directly. The wage number is driven by labor markets, not monetary policy. But the Fed's inability to bring inflation back to target without triggering a recession means the environment in which wages can't keep up with prices persists longer. The Fed is essentially telling the market, we see the problem, we don't have a clean solution, and we're going to wait until the picture is clearer before we do anything that makes one problem better by making another worse. That's a defensible position for an institution managing systemic risk. For a family watching their real wages decline while their grocery bill climbs, it's a less satisfying answer. The tension between what the Fed can do and what households need is one of the quieter stories running underneath every CPI report right now. And it doesn't resolve until either inflation comes down on its own, which requires the tariff and energy pressures to ease, or the economy slows enough that the choice between fighting inflation and supporting growth becomes less difficult. Neither of those outcomes is guaranteed. Both of them take time that working families don't have an unlimited supply. Most of the time, when inflation runs hot, there's one primary driver, one thing you can point to, one category that's doing most of the damage, one source of pressure that, if it resolves, brings the headline number back down with it. That's the version of inflation that monetary policy was built to handle. What's happening right now is different, and it's worth saying clearly why. Because 2 separate forces arrived at roughly the same time, and they operate through completely different mechanisms, which means the tools that address one don't necessarily address the other. The first force is the energy shock from the conflict with Iran. This one is dramatic and fast-moving. Gasoline up 28.4% year over year. Fuel oil up 54.3%. Energy costs across the board up 17.9%, the steepest annual increase since September 2022. The late February U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure sent oil markets into a spike that rippled through the entire cost structure of the American economy almost immediately. Everything that moves, trucks, planes, cargo ships, costs more to run. Every product that gets shipped absorbs those fuel costs. Airline fares are up 20.7% over the past year. The logistics surcharges that Amazon, FedEx, and USPS have been rolling out aren't coincidental. They're energy costs distributed across every package, every delivery, every order. The second force is tariff-driven goods inflation. Slower, less dramatic in any given week, but broader and more structural in how it operates. Clothing up 17.5 points. Coffee up 10. Furniture up 7.4%. Household furnishings up 0.7% in April alone. These increases don't have a single dramatic event behind them. They're the accumulated result of import cost increases, working their way through supply chains over months, arriving at retail prices on a rolling basis as pre-tariff inventory sells through and higher cost inventory replaces it. When a single category drives inflation, say, gasoline spikes after a supply disruption, households have a response available. They drive less, they carpool, they delay discretionary trips, they substitute and adjust until the pressure eases. It's painful but manageable because there's a target to respond to. When two separate forces are raising prices across different categories simultaneously, the substitution strategies that work for one don't work for the other. You can drive less to absorb the fuel shock. You cannot stop buying food, clothing, and household essentials to absorb the tariff shock. The categories hit by tariffs are not optional spending. There's no substitution that makes them go away. The compounding effect shows up in the data. April's core CPI, which strips out food and energy to give a cleaner read on underlying inflation, came in at 2.8% year over year, the highest since September 2025, and above forecasts. That means even after removing the energy shock entirely from the calculation, underlying price pressures are accelerating. The tariff component is showing up in core. It's not being masked by energy. It's running alongside it. Before the Iran conflict, multiple forecasters had already been revising inflation projections upward. J.P. Morgan Asset Management projected headline CPI would reach 3.5% by the fourth quarter of 2025 on tariff pressure alone. EY projected inflation peaking near 3.2% in early 2026 under a tariff-only scenario. Those projections were built without an energy shock layered on top. The April 2026 headline reading of 3.8% has already exceeded those forecasts, and with 7 months of data still to come, the trajectory is tracking well above where analysts expected it to be before the Iran factor entered the picture. What makes honest forecasting difficult right now is that the two drivers have different timelines and different resolution paths. The Iran energy shock can reverse relatively quickly if diplomatic conditions change. Oil markets respond fast to supply signals. Gasoline prices can drop $1.50 a gallon in a matter of weeks if the situation shifts. Tariff-driven inflation is stickier. The Harvard barcode data shows that when tariffs go up, retail prices follow quickly. But when tariffs come down or are struck down, as the Supreme Court did in February 2026 with the IEEPA tariffs, the pass-through to lower consumer prices is slower and depends heavily on whether retailers expect the policy to hold. If businesses think new tariffs are coming, they hold prices even when the immediate cause is removed. That uncertainty is its own economic drag. And right now, uncertainty about trade policy is essentially a permanent condition. Businesses planning inventory orders, pricing decisions, and capital investments are doing so without a stable baseline. That friction alone, even before a single tariff dollar is paid, slows investment, delays hiring, and produces a kind of chronic caution in the economy that doesn't show up cleanly in any single data point, but accumulates into something you can feel. The April CPI report is a data point. What it means for the next 6 months is not settled yet, and the honest answer, the one most coverage doesn't sit with long enough, is that the range of possible outcomes is wide, and which end of that range you land on depends on things that aren't resolved. That's not a comfortable conclusion, but it's the accurate one. So instead of a forecast, here's a framework. 3 things that could make this better, and 3 things that could make it worse. Starting with what could ease the pressure. The energy component of this inflation spike is the most volatile and the most reversible. Gasoline moved fast when the Iran conflict escalated. It can move fast in the other direction if conditions change. Diplomatic movement, a ceasefire, or even a credible de-escalation signal from the region could pull oil prices down meaningfully within weeks. Energy inflation at 17.9% year over year, with a 28.4% spike in gasoline is extreme, and extreme readings in volatile categories have historically corrected faster than structural inflation does. If the Iran situation shifts, that component of April's 3.8% can come down relatively quickly. The tariff picture also has a reversal mechanism, though it operates more slowly. The Supreme Court's February 2026 ruling struck down the IEPA tariffs as exceeding executive authority. The same day, the administration replaced them with new tariffs under Section 122 of the Trade Act, initially at 10%, later raised to 15%. Treasury Secretary Bessent stated publicly that combining the new tariffs with existing Section 232 and Section 301 duties would result in virtually unchanged tariff revenue for 2026, signaling that total trade costs for importers remain close to pre-ruling levels despite the change in legal mechanism. Research from the same Harvard economists tracking barcode prices showed that when Canada withdrew its retaliatory tariffs last year, retail prices of affected products fell rapidly in response. The mechanism works. The question is whether the policy environment stabilizes enough to let it. If tariff levels hold at current reduced rates without further escalation, some of the goods inflation, already baked into categories like clothing and furniture, should ease as higher-cost inventory sells through and replacement orders come in at lower import prices. Consumer behavior itself is a third factor working in the direction of lower inflation. Americans pulled back spending in April, according to Commerce Department retail sales data. Overall consumer spending rose just 0.2% from March, down from a 0.7% jump the month before, a signal that households are beginning to respond to the sustained price pressure with greater caution. When demand cools, pricing power weakens. Retailers sitting on inventory they can't move don't raise prices, they discount. A sustained pullback in consumer spending would slow inflation's momentum, though it comes with its own costs for employment and economic growth. Now, the three things that could make this worse, and these deserve serious attention. Pharmaceutical tariffs. In April 2026, the administration announced potential tariffs of up to 100% on brand name imported medications, with some taking effect as early as July 31st. Unlike clothing or furniture, where you can delay a purchase, buy secondhand, or go without, prescription medications for chronic conditions aren't optional. The 100% tariff applies specifically to patented brand name drugs, not generics, and generics account for roughly 90% of U.S. prescriptions. But for the households that depend on brand name medications with no approved generic equivalent, including certain newer treatments for diabetes, mental health conditions, and specialty diseases, a 100% tariff isn't a budget inconvenience. It's a genuine healthcare crisis delivered through a pricing mechanism. That's a smaller group than the broad framing suggests, but for those inside it, the exposure is severe. This has received far less coverage than the gasoline number, and it should receive more. Shelter costs are the second concern. The shelter index jumped 0.6% in April, partly explained by a methodology correction following last fall's government shutdown. But even accounting for that technical factor, housing costs are running hot. Shelter is the single largest component of the CPI. If it sustains elevated readings through summer, driven by persistently tight housing supply, and elevated mortgage rates, keeping would-be sellers locked into their current homes, the headline inflation number stays elevated even if energy and tariffs improve. A longer Iran conflict is the third and most consequential downside risk. Every additional month the energy shock persists, it compounds into more categories. Airlines have already passed fuel costs into fares at a rate that puts them up 20.7% year over year. Trucking surcharges flow into every product with a supply chain. Small manufacturers absorbing higher energy costs begin passing them through their own pricing. Energy inflation that looks like a spike can become embedded inflation if it lasts long enough. The June CPI report, covering May, releasing in mid-June, is the one to watch. May is when the first full wave of tariff-priced replacement inventory will start arriving in the data. April was still largely pre-tariff goods working through the system. May and June will tell a different story. The number that matters most isn't the one we just got. It's the one coming. Here's what doesn't change, regardless of how those numbers land. The fundamental squeeze that millions of American households are navigating right now is real. And it's not going away quickly. Wages grew 3.6% in April. Prices grew 3.8%. That gap is small in percentage terms and enormous in lived experience when you're on the wrong side of it. Not because of one decision or one event. Because two separate forces arrived in the same season and hit the same households. What gets built What gets negotiated? What policy gets changed? That's still being decided. The data doesn't wait for those decisions. Neither do the people reading it on a receipt. Which part of this surprised you most? Or, if you're feeling this in your own budget right now, tell me where it's hitting hardest. I want to know what people are actually experiencing out there.